Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today, and I will hold my talk in English. And the title is A Paradigmatic Shift from Capital to Love. What I'm going to be talking about mainly is care. And care is a topic that we hear a lot about, mostly related to the crisis of care. And when we speak about the crisis of care, what we mostly hear about is, discourses about time poverty, the fact that we are missing time for the important areas of our lives. Work-life balance. We are speaking about social depletion, hustle culture, burnout, etc. We're speaking about the gender pay gap, the fact that care work is at the root of the gender pay gap, is at the root of inequality between men and women. And we're speaking about the social reproduction contradiction. I'm going to be speaking about the social reproduction contradiction and what we need to do in order to move from a paradigm that is centered on capital to a paradigm that is centered on love and care. But before we do that, I'd like to delve a little bit in the discourse on care and look at what we are actually talking about. We live in a society that is divided in two main areas, and the market defines what is worthy. The market defines what brings status, what brings power, what brings access to resources. And the market is, or at least the work that is taking place within the market, wage labor, for example, is what we term work. This is the only type of work that we know. Wage labor is what defines work, what gives status, what gives access to resources, money, etc. So it's regulated by wage. It's giving place to status, recognition. It's visible, and it's productive, right? The idea that this type of work is essentially what is productive, essentially what is contributing to accumulation of capital, contributing to growth, contributing to the economy. And then on the other hand, we have other actors which contribute to this growth, but that are mainly remain under the radar, that are mainly institutions that are devalued, that are underfunded. And so we can speak about civil society associations, informal networks that are built between people in neighborhoods, etc. Public institutions, part of it, if we are looking at the education system, or, for example, care work, care for the elderly, or preschool, even the school system are areas that are vastly underfunded in our society. Neighborhoods also provide this type of care, and friendships and homes. So we're in a place where everything that happens outside of the market is not represented as a real actor. They're not represented as real actors that add value to our society. And so the sociologist Nancy Fraser is speaking about free riding on the life world. So capitalism, and this is the paradox that I was talking about earlier, in a capitalist society, capitalism needs to free ride on the labor of individuals, so mainly women, but also free ride on institutions that are not considered as such. And so she describes it as the capitalist economy relies on, or free rides, activities of provisioning, caregiving, and interaction that produce and maintain social bonds, although it accords them no monetized value and treats them as if they were free. And so that's the idea that this care work is provided mainly out of our nature, right? So it's a care work that is provided mainly, it's something that we do naturally. It is something that is part of our biological makeup. And for that reason, this work ought to remain hidden and ought to remain unpaid. But what we need to understand is that the activities of pregnancy, birthing, or raising, socializing the young, emotional labor, caring for the sick or for disabled people, maintaining households, building and sustaining communities, or managing and maintaining social interactions is the labor that we have always done. It's the labor that has kept us alive so far. Care work is not just a type of work that can be pushed to the margins of our lives. Care work is the core of our essence as human beings. And nevertheless, this type of work is not recognized as work, and for the simple reason that capitalism needs to frame this type of work as a work that is unproductive, that is unimportant, that is provided naturally, and that doesn't need to be paid. So what we see is that we have, on the one hand, social reproduction. On the other hand, we have economic production. One realm is seen as masculine. So we speak about the labor market, we speak about the at least it refers to the formal labor market, the idea of factories, the work, real work, what workers do in the economy. This is a type of work that is referred to as productive. for the social reproduction realm is something that is constructed and represented as feminine. It's a feminine work. It's something that is deeply tied to the biology of being women, for example. And we see that the reward for economic production is money, while the reward for social reproduction is love and virtue. And the virtue is attached to a culture of a cult, the cult of the good mother, the cult of the mother who would forget herself, forget her needs, and just give everything to her family and just feel fulfilled in this role without any conditions, right? But in a capitalist system, we cannot live of love and virtue. So in order to live, women who endorse this kind of work, women who perform this kind of work, end up being financially dependent on their husbands, creating the gender pay gap. This type of work is seen as innate, as I said, and the type of economic production is seen as skilled. So that's a main difference as well, because by seeing productive work or economic production as a skilled labor, it justifies as well the remuneration of this type of work with wages. And if it's innate, it doesn't need to be learned, it doesn't need to be acquired, and it's devalued more generally. So what we see is that feminism has adopted an attitude where it was all about divesting the social reproduction sphere and investing economic production. So for women to be emancipated, the idea was for them to leave behind their care duties and emancipate themselves and come to the level of masculine labor. Masculine labor, of course not, because the reproductive sphere, the idea that it's a masculine sphere, is also deeply ingrained in colonial society, because women have been working-class women worldwide, but also more specifically in the colonies and also during slavery, black women and indigenous women and colonized women were always part of the productive machinery, productive economy. And so this idea that this social reproduction sphere will remain a sphere that is devalued, a sphere that doesn't need to be invested, something that is done by itself, is conditioning the appropriation or even the institutional robbery of female labor in our societies. By whom? Well, by the capitalist system, but more specifically as well by the social group, social and political group men as a class, right? Because in heterosexual marriages, this is what happens. So essentially, this division of social reproduction and economic production has been the institutional basis for modern forms of women's subordination and patriarchal power. Okay, so I've laid the ground for this understanding the care crisis from a from a sociological standpoint. Now, let's take a step back and look at care in a bigger, or at least in a more expansive way, in a broader perspective. What is care? Care is, care can be delineated in many ways. Care is to be found in many movements. In all movements for social justice, what is at the core of it is a departure from a paradigm centered on capital to a paradigm centered on care. If you look at the feminist movement, for example, the idea is to revalue care, to also see the value of human beings, even if they're not holding political power like it is defined in our society. One of the goals, of course. If we look at the anti-racist movement, the decolonial movement, the idea as well is to move from capital to care in order to recognize that inequalities are rooted in a system that has divided people according to their worthiness on the labor market, if they're worthy workers or unworthy workers, looking at them from the prism of capital. The same can be said for the disability justice movement, where the value of human beings is defined according to their productivity. You have a body that is worthy if it can contribute to the accumulation of capital, physically and mentally. But what is a worthy body, if we think of it? If you have a body and if you live in it, you're worthy. If we look from a care paradigm, but from a capital paradigm, it's a very different story. And then again, for other movements, for the peace movement, the anti-war movement is rooted in the idea that capital should not be the decision maker, that capital should not be the reason why we're making decisions on on borders and nations and other types of state apparatus, violent state apparatus that enforces wars, right? Because at the root of wars, it's not really conflict between people. What we see in wars is that capital is the defining factor. It's always the biggest part of the equation that is left out as well, because we need a discourse that tells us that we need to be safe, right? The same can be said about the climate justice. Of course, this is where it's most visible, right? In the climate justice, we have a system that wants to depart from the idea of capitalism as the main denominator in all decision-making processes. And the same as well for all other human rights. And I decided to show the housing as a human right simply because housing, or at least the homelessness crisis, is the epitome of a capitalist system that provides rewards based on achievements, right? So you can be alive in a capitalist system if you contribute to the economy. You can be alive in capitalism if you are part of the machinery. And so the fact that homeless people do exist is also a reminder, a constant reminder that we need to be part of this system, that we cannot just decide to leave out the system. I think people in the room here, who has never, ever thought or ever been scared of being homeless? Okay. So we see that it's a fear that is very common. It's a fear that is inherent to capitalism. Capitalism needs to plant this fear in our heads and keep us part of the system as an essential feature of who we are as human beings. So what maintains this? We have a system in the current capitalist paradigm. The trickle-down economics, you've probably heard of this, but trickle-down economics is the main ideology behind it. Or it's a discourse, it's not an ideology. It's a discourse saying that if the richest people get richer, it will have a trickle-down effect on other people. And so initially, the idea is that the big glass would spill over the other glasses and that everybody would be better off. As we can see, trickle-down economics is a trick. It's not real. Trickle-down economics is a discourse that is maintaining the status quo, that is making us believe that by working hard, we will make more money, and by making more money, we will be happier, we will be fulfilled, etc. And so we see this as well in the feminist movement. This trickle-down process, this trickle-down principle is to be found as well in neoliberal feminism, showing that if the most privileged women come to the top, crack the glass ceiling, it will have a trickle-down effect on other women. Hasn't been the case so far? Well, unfortunately not, simply because trickle-down principles just do not work in our capitalist system. The idea is not redistribution. The core of the capitalist system is accumulation and not redistribution. So it means that we would need to get off that trap, the neoliberal trap of feminism, but generally the neoliberal trap, and go against liberal individualism that tells us that if we individually make it, we will be fine. And also speaking in terms of gender egalitarianism, meaning that women need to be more like men in our society in order to succeed. That emancipation essentially means adopting masculine codes, a masculine culture, a masculine patriarchal capitalist culture. It is not. So what do we need to do? Well, in order to move from the capital paradigm, in order to move from this capital paradigm where capital defines is the rationale behind every policy, behind institutions, behind the economy. I give an example. Institutions exist to protect capital. Right? So if we take any institution, okay, I take the institution of marriage because this is one institution that interests me particularly. The rationale behind, or at least the function of marriage, is to guard capital and to make sure that a certain form of labor is performed for free by women in these entities. Right? So the rationale behind marriage is the capital. If you look at another institution, let's say the police, right? The police as an institution, the function of the police has never been to protect citizens. It has been to protect power and to protect capital, right? So initially, the police was created in order to protect the capital of rich people against the masses of poorer people. It has evolved, you might say, and institutions evolve, they do, for sure. But we have to look at the fact that the main tenet or the main function of almost all institutions in our society is to reproduce capital or to protect capital. The last example that I will give is education. If you look at the school system, or at least schooling and education, is not here to teach and really truly teach little humans to become humans and to become older humans who will contribute to society in a meaningful way, who will be happy, who will learn how to survive. No, the main function of the education system is social reproduction, is the reproduction of hierarchies that maintain the capitalist system. So how do we move from there? Well, in order to move from there and to come into a paradigm centered around care, so if I say care, I could also say love. I know that love is a little bit of a cringy word in our capitalist societies because we see it as a dreamy state, something that has really nothing to do with rational thought, that has very little to do with politics. Well, actually, it has everything to do with it. If we're alive today, it's not because of capital, it's because of love. And so in order to move from there, we need to move from a paradigm built around the ego, a pyramidal paradigm that defines value and worth according to rank in a hierarchy. This is what has been projected onto the living world, onto the earth. So we see the world as a big pyramidal system, as a food chain would be the best example. But the world is not a pyramidal system. The world is an ecosystem. It's an ecosystem where hierarchies do exist, but they're shifting, they're flexible. They're not built, or they're not built to maintain power or to accumulate resources. And so that's why we need to move from there to there. So when I say this, the image that we have is like a magical world, something that is very utopian, that we can never recover, because that's true. We cannot recover that world. Maybe it existed at some point, but humans were, for a very short time, part of it. But so we see it as romantic, utopian, unrealistic, dreamy, irrational, naive, something that is not viable. It's a world that we cannot create. So that's why we hang on to what we know. We hang on to capital because this is what gives us the illusion of security. It is what gives us the illusion of being alive, being worthy. We have learned to see capital as our main essence. It is not. So, okay, let's move to a vision that would be a little bit less utopian, maybe. Okay, a world that is a vision that could be thousands of them. We don't know what the world would look like once we overcome capital. We will overcome capital at some point, but we don't know what it's going to look like yet. And so what is keeping us from this is fear. And fear is keeping us from envisioning this world. And simply, we can see this fear being materialized by words like, oh, but what is the alternative? I want to know what's coming next. Never in the history of humanity have we known what was coming next once a system that was no longer viable collapsed. So we have to be able to withstand the unknown. We have to be able to withstand the insecurity and the fact that we don't yet know. But our species is full of resources. We have it in us as well to surpass this time. Again, our society, our species has survived so long, not because of capital, not because of labor markets, not because of financial markets. It has survived because of communities, because of collaboration, cooperation, because of the creativity we have within us in order to adapt to new systems and new contexts. And so here I want to give inspiration that comes from trees. And this inspiration regards the system, the root system that is present in forests between trees. And so it's called by scientists the wood wide web. It's something that is contentious, but I'm not going to speak about the resistance towards that, because there has been so many studies as well showing the relevance of these networks. So what it is, it's that millions of species of fungi and bacteria swap nutrients between soil and the roots of trees, forming a vast interconnected web of organisms throughout the woods. So what it shows is that trees cooperate instinctively between each other. They know that the survival of one tree is dependent on the survival of all trees in the wood. So if one tree is missing nutrients and water, the roots of other trees will transport these nutrients and the water to the tree that is in distress, right? And I think that this is a feature that is also part of our essence that has been unlearned, mainly because of the fear I was talking about earlier. The fear of not having enough, the fear of losing it all, the fear of not being worthy, the fear of dying. So the trees, they act not as individuals, but somehow as a collective. What we see is the power of unity. What happens to one happens to us all. And we can starve together or feast together. And so that's the botaniker Robin Wall-Kimmerer who wrote this in Braiding Sweetgrass. And so it may sound, and again, like when people are so caught into their system, their political systems, they tend to see that as romanticism. To me, what is romanticism, or at least what is deeply unrealistic, is to believe that we can continue on like that and that the world will continue to thrive, right? So being attached to capital, is that what is deeply naive more than believing in a network like this also present amongst humans? In the end, again, like if we look at the story of capitalism and we take it from a whole hour, capitalism would be merely 6 minutes or so. So that's why we have the resources to overcome this and move from a paradigm that is pyramidal, where what defines success is IQ and effort. So the centrality of intelligence and what is intelligence, the very, very homogeneous idea, very simplified idea of what intelligence is and also what effort is. So this is something that is ableist because it tells us that only bodies without disabilities which are productive are worthy. It is also a racist myth, because if we look at the way resources and power are distributed in our society, we can see as well that the richest people, the most powerful people on earth are white, so it's only one step to define this as a genetic lack or a genetic deficit. It's a patriarchal and classist myth, simply because it's based on the same hierarchies that rationalize inequality. They rationalize and they justify inequality, seeing it as the result, like a natural result of a natural order, right? So in order to break with this idea, we need to break with the idea of success being a result of IQ and effort, because it is not. And in such a paradigm, care is stigmatized. It means that needing care, it's an ableist myth to believe that needing care makes you weak. So people who need care, at least all of us need care at some point in our lives. It is the one constant that we all share as humans. At some point in time, we all have needed care when we were born, when we were children, and we all will need care when we grow older, for those of us who survive that time. And so it means that we live in a paradigm where needing care brings us back to our weakness, and it's something that brings shame. So we need to break with that shame. And in order to do that, I wanted to mention one type of relationship in our capitalist system that holds a lot of potential, and they're friendships, because they're unregulated, they're voluntary, chosen, driven by pleasure, which is a very important aspect if we speak about care, and they're rooted in care, meaning that those friendships, unlike other types of relationships, let's say parent-child relationship, or husband-wife relationship, or wife-wife, husband-husband, or employer-employee, all these relationships have, or the state has, an interest in these relationships. There is a political, social, and economic interest in these relationships. So friendships are allowed to be a place of failure, of doubt and trial and error, places of slowness, of uselessness, of imperfect anchoring, where there are no financial, political, or legal utility. And there's no state control, which leaves these relationships in a lawless state that gives so much freedom and creativity to just let emerge what we were intended to do as humans, namely care for each other. What we need to redefine as well is the idea of work, right? So we see work as wage labor, as the only type of work that is worthy of remuneration, that is worthy of status, etc. We need to move away from this and include other forms of work, such as care work, cultural work, emotional labor, political work, psychological work, everything that we do. These are activities, human activities that we do that are as important as the rest. But so how do we do that? Because many people stay stuck in the idea of the feasibility. How do we move beyond this? We have financial markets that hold everything together. We all have bank accounts. We all have credit cards. How do we move from a paradigm centered on capital to a paradigm centered on care? Well, we need to move away from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset. And so it sounds very like wishy-washy spirituality talk, but that's actually really what we need to do, and I explain you why. We live in a place of fear, right? The main emotion that is motivating policymakers, the economy, is scarcity. The fear of not having enough, the fear of losing, the fear of losing power, right? So in order to move to abundance, what we need to do is to represent, or at least to understand that we are already in abundance. We don't need to arrive there. We already live in a very abundant planet, in a very abundant world, right? So we have internalized the fact that we need to get more and more, but what we can see is that Elon Musk owns $180 billion. We don't even fathom how much money it is. So just a quick calculation. In order to get to that sum of money, I would need to give you $100,000 a day, starting 5,000 years ago, and still today, you wouldn't be as rich as Elon Musk. Right? So at the time of the pyramids, I would have started to give you every single day $100,000. So it means we have enough. There's enough money, right? Also, the money that is generated, we see that when it's necessary, from the point of view of the government, the money is being generated. So money needs to take on we have enough. And money needs to take on a different meaning. Currently, it means power, status, personal worth, and success. There's so much affect that is tied to money. And so we need to move to a situation where we see money as a means of exchange, because money is no longer a means of exchange. It is that, but it's so much more than that. We need to make it a means of survival, something that helps us survive, but just a means, not an end in itself, not something that defines our value, defines our worth. It should have no affective value whatsoever, and we're very, very far from that. And to finish, we are already underway. This paradigmatic shift is already taking place. We see the anger in the world that is the result of the realization that we live in an unjust world. The world that we live in has the possibility to be something else. So if we look at, we need to redefine power, worth and value, success, growth, and work. And then, if we look at the energy that is present in all the movements for social justice, right, the ones that I mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of anger that defines those movements. But anger is or can be anchored in love. Anger can be anchored in care and love, because simply this is the emotion that tells us that we deserve better. And we will get that. Thank you for your attention. Thank you so much.